How did this happen? Is it just that he saw a picture and thought Trump was a stud?
It was the animalistic. No,
I
just
just
kidding.
find that
So I,
so hilarious. I don't know. That's ridiculous. Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that everything in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. You would usually hear my co-host, Vivi Ganeshanathan, also known as Sugi, speaking here, but she is on book tour in India and Sri Lanka, so we were giving her a break. But that doesn't mean any of us or any of the rest of us are getting a break. Here are just a few of the things that the members of the new tech oligarchy have been up to before and after Donald Trump's inauguration just a few short weeks ago. Item 1. On January 7th, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg ended Facebook's fact-checking program and shelved Meta's DEI initiatives. Item 2. On January 10th, Mark Zuckerberg traveled to Mar-a-Lago to negotiate a settlement on a lawsuit Donald Trump had filed against Meta. Item number 3. On January 20th, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, Google CEO Sundar Pichai, and Elon Musk, CEO of Twitter and Tesla, all attended Trump's inauguration. Item number 4. Last week, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, otherwise known as DOGE, gained control of the Treasury Department's payment system. Item number 5. Last week, Musk and his DOGE organization shut down USAID. Item number 6. Just this week, Google scrapped some of its diversity hiring targets following an executive order issued by President Donald Trump that was aimed in part at pressuring government contractors to scrap their DEI initiatives. There's more. I could have 100 items on this list, which I think is part of the point, but we're going to try to cover as much as we can about the influence that the Silicon Valley's tech oligarchs have over the president and the U.S. government and the influence that President Trump has over them. And to do that, we are going to talk to Michael Scherer and Ashley Parker. Ashley Parker is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Previously, Parker, a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, spent 8 years at The Washington Post, where she covered all 4 years of Donald Trump's first presidency, was White House bureau chief during President Joe Biden's first 2 years, and covered the 2024 presidential campaign as a senior national political correspondent. Before that, she spent more than a decade at The New York Times, where she covered the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns and Congress. She is also a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. Welcome, Ashley.
thank you.
Michael Scherer is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He previously worked as a national political reporter for The Washington Post, the Washington bureau chief of Time magazine, and the Washington correspondent for Salon. He started his career at the Daily New Hampshire Gazette in Northampton, Massachusetts. Welcome, Michael.
Daily Hampshire Gazette, but yes.
There, I messed that up.
Yeah, but glad to be here.
On January 20th, which seems like a very long time ago now, you both wrote an article for The Atlantic titled The Tech Oligarchy Arrives, which is how we originally got in touch with you and wanted to have you on the show. What made you decide that this was the territory you wanted to focus on for some of your first work at The Atlantic?
Well, we had literally just started, both of us, at The Atlantic the week before Trump's inauguration, and Michael in particular was very stressed about getting points on the board and writing a story. So we were both, it's true. So we were both kind of trying to figure out what's the thing we can say about the inauguration that feels interesting and different. And we realized that all of these tech bros coming to Washington and the little bits of reporting we were picking up of where they were going to be seated during the inauguration, who had invited them, Trump himself, what sort of parties they were hosting, just felt new and different. And like we could tell our readers, not just some new reporting, but sort of the beginnings of a story that we believe is going to be pretty influential, at least in these early months of Trump's second time back in the White House.
Yeah, I would just add to that Trump's first term, when he came to office, he had very few friends. There were very few people in Congress who really wanted to tolerate him. Even among Republicans, there were not many major donors. Captains of industry were also kind of trying to keep him at arm's length. And I think that tech leaders being at the inauguration were a symbol of one of the biggest shifts that we've had, 8 years later when he's come back. The opposition that greeted him before has basically gone away. And I think in part because of the popular vote, in part because he clearly knows better what he's doing this time around, has sharper plans, in part because he has said retribution is on the menu, and that's what he's after. There's a lot of kissing of the ring that's going on, and having those people, in some cases, in front of the cabinet, standing on the stage
Yeah.
there at the inauguration, right behind the family, was a showman's move. I mean, he was showing that, like, the most powerful, the wealthiest. I mean, he always has graded people by wealth. So some of the wealthiest people in the world are on my side this time.
Well, speaking of that change, you write in the article about the contrast between the way that Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, greeted Trump's presidency in 2017 and the way he reacted today. I mean, could you talk about that? And do you have any theories as to why he's changed so completely?
Yeah. So if you listen to him, he says it's been sort of a personal evolution, that he didn't think hard enough about how to manage political debate online before, that he feels the Biden administration, Democrats put too much pressure on him during that term and before the 2020 election to
It's always
moderate
Biden's fault.
posts. Yes, to moderate posts. He's also undergone kind of a personal journey. I mean, a few weeks before the inauguration, he goes on Joe Rogan and talks about the value of masculine energy in
Man.
the boardroom, and how he's been learning about himself through mixed martial arts fighting. He's done a lot of things. He obviously changed the way they're moderating content. One of the first meetings he had with Trump, and he went down to Mar-a-Lago multiple times. Um, one of the pieces of this is that, well, actually, you're going to ask me a later question about
Well,
that.
you can talk about that. Talk about wrote a January 29th article on Meta's settlement with Trump.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that was just another kissing of the ring. Just to give your listeners some backstory here, after the January 6th riots in 2021, Trump sued then Facebook, YouTube, and then Twitter, saying that they had violated the First Amendment by enforcing their own policies to kick him off their services. And it was a very bizarre lawsuit because the First Amendment restricts what the government does. It does not restrict what private business does. There's no First Amendment. You don't have a First Amendment right to say whatever you want in the Atlantic, or the Atlantic gets to decide what is written in the Atlantic. But his argument was that there had been pressure from government officials that had forced this change to happen. It was a weird argument, in part because he was the government at the time, right? He was president of the United States at the time that this all happened. And in the course of the lawsuits that followed, they really couldn't come up with any evidence that this had happened, that these changes had been made because of government pressure. They had some quotes from lawmakers who had said, "I think it should happen. We'll look at regulation of big tech companies," but there was no direct instruction. And so broadly, the legal community did not think these lawsuits had any merit to them. But after the election, Zuckerberg goes down to Mar-a-Lago. They have their meeting, and pretty soon he's back with lawyers negotiating a settlement. That settlement has since come out, which I wrote about, for $25 million. Twitter, now X, now owned by Elon Musk, top donor and advisor to the president, announced that it was seeking a settlement. They both have put Google in a very difficult position now, because Google has not engaged in any of this so far, but the appellate court ruling that would have gotten Google off the hook, many people expected, has now been put off because X is settling. And so there's all these ways in which Trump was immediately exerting his power over these executives, and these executives were allowing him to do it. They weren't fighting. They have bigger fish to fry at this point.
Let's talk about another. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was just going to add, when Michael was talking about Mark Zuckerberg undergoing this personal evolution, talking about the importance of a masculine energy. Michael and I were just recently out for drinks with a sort of a Trump confidant who also knows some of these tech folks, and was saying there was something about that moment in Butler, Pennsylvania, when the attempted assassination, and obviously that iconic photo where he's sort of lifted back up by Secret Service and waves his fist in the air and mouths fight, fight, fight. That this person said tapped into something almost animalistic in these tech executives, a certain macho-ness they just instantly understood. I mean, Elon has basically said that was one of the reasons he decided to come over and actually endorse Trump and get engaged. Jeff Bezos calls Trump, immediately afterwards. And so for a lot of these guys, and sort of fitting, we would call them the tech bros, there was something about that moment that drew them more closely to Trump.
They also each have very complicated regulatory problems with the federal government right now.
Yeah,
Two of the companies
we're
are
going to
being
get to that.
Yeah,
We're going to get to that part.
Okay.
I want to talk about Bezos, though, the way that his changed too. I mean, both of you worked for the Post. He bought the Post in 2013. The paper adopted the slogan "Democracy Dies in Darkness" in 2017, which seemed to many people, including me, to be aimed at the incoming Trump administration. But he famously killed the paper's endorsement of Kamala Harris during the 2024 campaign, and now here he is. Bezos is visiting Mar-a-Lago also and funding and attending Trump's inauguration. Same question. How did this happen? Is it just that he saw a picture and thought Trump was a stud?
It was the animalistic. No, just kidding.
So hilarious. I don't know. That's ridiculous.
I mean, one misconception, I think, a little bit about the "Democracy Dies in Darkness" slogan. I always go back to something that Marty Baron, our editor-in-chief, executive editor at that moment, said that went along with it, which is, "We're not at war, we're at work." And so "Democracy Dies in Darkness" sort of felt like doing what newspapers do, what the Washington Post does so well, which is to hold power to account. And we certainly did that. Held Donald Trump to account in his first term, but we also did that with Joe Biden and the Kamala Harris campaign. So that I understand why you might have interpreted it as very specifically geared towards Donald Trump, but that was sort of a broader thing that the Washington Post always does and continues to do. And I think the challenge with someone like Jeff Bezos pulling the Kamala Harris endorsement, and he can speak for himself. He wrote an explanation that people can choose to believe or not as to why he did it. And, coming to the inauguration and basically sitting on Trump's lap. The challenge there is that you have great journalists at the Washington Post and great editors. And to be clear, it would be problematic had Bezos sat on Barack Obama's lap, right? It's not a Trump thing. It's an uncomfortable thing with an owner of a newspaper, but that's an owner's prerogative. And so what I will say is, for the 8 years I worked at the Post, where I covered all 4 years of the Trump presidency, the first 2 years of the Biden administration, and then I moved over and covered this most recent campaign. Jeff Bezos never once meddled in our copy. He never once touched the journalism. He didn't, to my knowledge, he didn't ask an editor and anyone to touch it. If that had happened, you would know, everyone would know, there would be mass resignations, and there would have been. And there were moments, especially in the first Trump term, where we were writing stories about Trump that made Trump unhappy, and he was trying to take it out on Amazon and on Jeff Bezos. And
I do remember that. Yeah.
And we never heard a single word. And so again, what's tricky is when Bezos shows up at the inauguration or goes down to Mar-a-Lago or pulls an endorsement, it gives people, understandably, a reason to sort of superimpose their worst fears and their worst conspiracies on what's going on. But the truth is, he has not meddled, and I think you would know if and when he does.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think it's important for your listeners to understand how newspapers work, and that there is an editorial page and there are op-ed contributors and opinion writers. They answer up to the publisher through their own chain of command. The reporters, we were both reporters there for the first Trump term and the Biden term. We report up to our own editor, who eventually reports to the publisher, but they're entirely separate tracks, and there's a wall between them. And the tradition is in newspapers that an owner can influence the editorials, that the owner can weigh in on what kind of opinion journalists he wants to hire or she wants to hire. And that is their prerogative. And so, like, I speak personally, I wasn't as upset as many are upset really at all. Unlike many of the readers of the Washington Post, when he pulled the endorsement, I didn't really care. It didn't affect my work. It didn't affect what I was doing. It was never asked of me. Now, the underlying question of why Bezos has made this shift, I think for that, we just have to point to the obvious things. I mean, he has said publicly that the obvious conflicts he has, because his companies are before the government every single day, somewhere meeting with a government official, are really complicating for him as a newspaper owner. And so he admits that outright. I think, he is invested enormous amounts of his own money into a rocket ship company that needs federal funding. And President Trump in the first term made very clear that he would punish Amazon, or attempt to punish Amazon, because of what he saw as the wrongs of his newspaper. And so I think it's totally reasonable to believe that Bezos came into this thinking he was in a vulnerable position. Elon Musk, the guy who runs the other rocket company that's actually right now more successful than Bezos's rocket company, is the top donor of the president, a personal advisor of the president. He's kind of on the outside, and I think I don't know why he pulled that endorsement, but those are all facts that give you context of his decision to pull that endorsement.
To answer your question of what happened to the Post, which I think was the broad question, the last thing I would say is it's the Washington Post. There's great editors, there's great reporters, they're doing great journalism. Even in the weeks since we've left for the Atlantic, they've had stories, great scoops we wish we had had. And I think the answer to that question really comes down to the current publisher, Will Lewis, and if he is able to articulate a business plan and stop the Post from hemorrhaging money and win back the trust and respect from the newsroom, which he has almost entirely lost.
So we've already talked briefly about this lawsuit about that Trump filed, alleging that X, Facebook, and YouTube had unlawfully removed his social media accounts from under government pressure after January 6th attacks on the Capitol. And your article lists some of these things, but I wonder if you could just talk to our listeners about some other examples of these very powerful tech oligarchs needing relief from suits filed by Trump or from regulatory actions that might be or have already been initiated by the US government.
Yeah, I think the best example is someone we haven't mentioned yet, and someone who actually wasn't on the stage at the inauguration, Larry Ellison, the owner of Oracle. He, unlike the others, is a longtime supporter of Trump. He's had fundraisers for Trump, and has been close personally with Trump in Palm Beach and elsewhere. His son is about to buy Paramount Global, basically the owner of CBS, the news organization. Trump had filed a lawsuit after or before the election, I think, or right after the election, alleging election interference by 60 Minutes because of how they edited an interview with Kamala Harris. If you got 1,000 First Amendment attorneys in a room, I would be surprised if 10 of them said that was a case that was likely to go very far. And what we have now is CBS lawyers meeting to settle that case as well. And the most obvious reason for that is that Paramount Global needs government approval for that merger to go forward. Larry Ellison's son will not get to run a TV network if the Trump administration stands in the way. And he's trying to play nice. He was in the Oval Office with Rupert Murdoch just last week for reasons that have yet to be reported, just sitting on the side while the president talked to reporters. So yeah, Facebook, Google, both have ongoing antitrust actions before the government. There are lawsuits scheduled to go to court. How the federal government decides to play those cases matters a great deal to those companies, matters a great deal to the consumers of the products they make. So there are dozens and dozens of ways. I mean, Google is a major contractor with the U.S. government in lots of ways. Amazon's a major contractor with the U.S. government. So there are lots and lots of ways in which these companies' interests could be decided by a vindictive chief executive.
This gets to a core question that I have, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to sort of foreground it. Is this really just a marriage of convenience, these tech oligarchs who you write about in this article? Were they people who genuinely opposed the January 6th insurrection, believed in democracy and diversity, and wanted to curb disinformation on their platforms, but they just now see a practical need to cozy up to Trump? Or were they originally just bowing down to what they thought was popular opinion? And now this is, well, they really wanted to act, and now they're going to get to be the way they want to.
I mean, you kind of have to take each one individually, which I won't do here. But the answer is kind of both, right? A lot of this is a marriage of convenience. Once some of the tech bros go, then kind of all of the tech bros have to go, because to not go, to not cozy up is making a statement in and of itself and in its own right. There's also, as someone put it to us, when Trump wins with a mandate, and again, people can quibble about that definition of mandate, right? It was still a very close election, a very slim election, but he won not just the electoral college, he won the popular vote, he beat Kamala Harris in every single battleground state. A lot of these people look at their companies and say, our shareholders, our users, the country elected this man, which they did, right? They knew who Donald Trump was. I think you can actually make the case that you fundamentally knew, whether you liked him or didn't like him, who Donald Trump was when you went and voted for him in 2016. But you certainly knew by this time when you voted, this is what he's promising to do. So there's some sort of support from their user base behind this is another factor. And then the flip side is, as someone was describing also, that there is a strain of sort of anti-wokeness in Silicon Valley. And again, it doesn't mean that every single one of these particular CEOs ascribes to that, but that does exist in these companies, in these circles. And some of, for instance, the anti-DEI stuff is very much in line with that.
I would just add that I think that's right, that each individual is an individual, and how they're behaving is complicated. It's also true that their identity is business leader, and business leader's job is to grow the business and maximize profit for shareholders. During the Obama administration, a lot of these companies were very close to Democrats. Eric Schmidt,
That's what I remember.
was the head of Google. He ended up starting venture firms to create technology for the Democratic Party. Mark Zuckerberg, if you remember, in the 2020 election, spent hundreds of millions of dollars from his foundation to make sure there was voter access during COVID. It was nonpartisan funding to election offices around the country, but Republicans interpreted it as helping Democrats, and it was true that Democratic operatives were advising him in those recommendations, in that spending.
And you mentioned in the article that really pissed off Trump, and he said a lot of negative things about Zuckerberg because of that.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, Zuckerberg, I also mentioned in the article, or we also mentioned in the article, that Zuckerberg wrote a letter right after Trump got into office, objecting to the Muslim ban and some of his immigration actions. One of the founders of Google was protesting the Muslim ban in 2017. So
at the airport, showed up at the airport impromptu with the masses of protesters.
Yeah, so this is not the first time that tech executives have put themselves in a political space. I think it is what distinguishes it is Obama didn't put them front and center on the stage and sort of like display them as hood ornaments in the way that Trump has been doing. But that's really about the personality of the president.
Well, and that's also that's also one of the interesting things. I mean, we quoted Steve Bannon, who's very opposed to this in our article, but he was saying these tech leaders don't. This isn't the flex that these tech leaders think it is, right? And he sort of he made Michael's hood ornament point, right? He said it's like walking into Teddy Roosevelt's game lodge and seeing all these, heads of stuffed kill on display. And, he sort of said these tech nerds what are they getting for this, right? Like they're sitting up there, ahead of the cabinet. You have Republican lawmakers pushed into the overflow room, and it's just serving Trump's ego, his vanity, whatever purpose he chooses. They're hoping they're getting something out of it, right? Whether it's a contract they need or a regulation they want rolled back, but there's no guarantee that happens.
Well, you are reporters and so have to report only facts. I'm a novelist and I also do reporting, but I think about internal things that I can make up and make broad generalizations. And what it feels like to me is that these guys have no internal principles at all. I mean, Bannon is a committed ideologue, right? And he knows these guys aren't like me and they'll change later. That's what it feels like to me. But um, okay, so speaking of the news of today, we're recording on Friday, February 7th. You all just dropped a big scoop on the Atlantic that you had to tweet about before we started the show, which maybe we'll get a chance to talk about. But the news of the past week has been all about Elon Musk, right? And Doge. Engineers controlled by Musk and Doge, all of them under age 26, took over USAID last week, infiltrating secure areas. By Friday, the new leadership of USAID, or USAID, however you want to say it, put all direct hire personnel around the world on administrative leave. And according to The Guardian, the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 presented USAID as a, quote, pilot test for a large-scale overhaul of the federal government that would downsize agencies and arbitrarily move federal employees to looser contracts that made them easier to fire. Now, this is not what you specifically reported on, but I just wanted to know if you thought that that was right.
Right as a moral question, or
No,
right as accurate?
Is that what's happening?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, presidents for decades and decades have wanted to change the way the government functions, but they tend to do it by going to Congress and asking for new appropriations that change the priorities that fund the government. So if you wanted to get rid of a USAID program, you would go to the Senate and the House and tell the appropriators, let's stop funding, whatever it is, abortion access in Africa. And then they would haggle it out and they would do it. Trump's entire approach, and this is after years of preparation, and Musk is really the front man for it, is that he should have the ability to make these decisions on his own about how the government spends money, irregardless of what was appropriated and what was paid for. I mean, he's closing agencies and firing officials who were hired under the last administration in some cases, but were funded through bipartisan legislation in Congress. So it is all happening right now. Musk is approaching it as he's approached much in his life, with the thinking that the way to understand and take control of government is through computer networks and code and figuring out where things are. And I think USAID is the flashiest example of what he's doing, but his team is burrowing into all these different agencies right now, and we don't know what exactly he's going to do, and we don't know what the courts will hold up as having been legal, a few months from now once they've heard all the arguments.
I should say that there have been, I was just checking online, some injunctions or restraining orders for the Treasury data access and
Yep.
the letters that he sent to federal workers offering them some sort of ill-defined settlement if they were to retire, and the federal funding freeze. So some of this is going to play out in the courts.
Yeah, and the biggest case is going to be over this idea, and I don't think we know the vehicle for it, but it's coming, of impoundment. In the 1970s, early 1970s.
We did a whole episode on this about 2 weeks
Okay,
ago.
so you know about impoundment, so I don't have to tell everybody
your
again.
listeners are up to date. Yeah.
Say it again. Don't assume that the listeners listen to our previous episode.
Well, briefly, basically, Congress got fed up in the 70s of presidents not doing what they told them to do with the federal money. And so they passed a law and said, if the president doesn't want to spend money that is appropriated by Congress, to impound that money, the president can only do it under certain conditions. And there were a couple, sort of narrow ways they could do it. This administration has been very clear coming in. They don't think that law was constitutional and they want to challenge it. They think the president has a constitutional right to just not spend what he doesn't want to spend, regardless of what Congress tells him to do, in violation of a law that's on the books. So, I mean, we will come to a point, I expect, in the next several years where the Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether the way the government has worked since, 55 years, for 55 years is the way it's going to work going forward or not.
Ashley, you recently wrote about a memo from the Office of Management and Budget calling for a temporary pause on all federal loans and grants, that was a story before the Musk stuff all happened. And this was not, as far as I could tell, a Doge operation. And then the White House ended up rescinding that memo, as Trump has also ended up rescinding for the moment his tariff threats against Canada and Mexico. Speaking as an outsider in Kansas City, it seems like Doge has been more effective and more, from my perspective as a Democrat, dangerous than anything Trump has been up to. Were you surprised by this, or was this how you expected things to play out?
Well, the White House rescinded the OMB memo, but they didn't rescind what they were. It's a little confusing. They didn't rescind what they were ultimately trying to do, that temporary funding pause. But the memo itself was sort of a rogue memo, the work of the general counsel there, and the language was understandably very alarming. It caused a kind of mass freakout across the country. So they did rescind that. I will say that was the first thing to me that felt like Trump 1.0. It had this sort of chaotic, scrambly feel that was a lot of Trump's first term in office. I even think of the travel ban. He had promised a travel ban. He called it a Muslim ban, but he'd promised a travel ban on the campaign trail. So in theory, it's something his team should have known was coming when he took office in 2017. And then they roll out this executive order that's poorly written and catches everyone off guard. And there's, people in transit between countries, and it's just sort of a chaotic mess where the White House is kind of reeling and doesn't have good answers and ends up backtracking. And again, people can disagree with what Trump is doing now. You, as a self-proclaimed Democrat, probably very clearly do. But he's being quite effective with what he's doing. Although there certainly are legal challenges, and we'll see how much of this actually makes it through. But again, this kind of OMB memo was the first thing that felt like something that would have happened with kind of less competent Trump and his crew 8 years ago.
So this is going to be a larger question, which is that for the most part, Trump's first term felt like the government that I was familiar with was still there after he was done. Like it didn't change in some substantial way. But these efforts through Doge, accessing this Treasury data. There are 20 Doge employees, according to the Washington Post, working at the Department of Education. This past Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported that they'd infiltrated the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and access key systems there as well. I mean, I don't know. Are you both in Washington right now or nearby?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Does it feel like there's like a government takeover happening? I mean, does it feel different? Does this seem weird? I mean, it's very odd to me just to watch like teams of unelected people walking into government agencies and plugging devices into computers. I've never seen anything like that before.
Well, I think your question is whether he will be more effective in the second term at changing things than he was in the first. I think the answer is yes. I don't think we know how much he's going to change. I mean, it's likely the Department of Education doesn't exist in the same way it does now. It's likely USAID doesn't exist in the way it does now because there's a Republican Congress and Republican Senate. I would push back a little bit in that, like, Doge employees are government employees. They were hired by the administration. The president of the United States, I mean, some of them are special government employees. They're not full-time permanent employees, but president of the United States gets to hire people to run agencies. That's part of the deal. Whether he can close agencies that he doesn't like is an open question, but having his own employees, his own appointees go in and access a computer system is not unusual. I think what is unusual is the hostility with which this has taken place, and the fact that anyone who stood in the way has been summarily fired, and Elon Musk has been live tweeting the whole thing with quite a bit of hostility aimed at the civil service. That's never happened before. But I don't think so. So we don't know. Like, does it matter that someone who's 19 instead of 45 is in a certain Treasury database? Maybe, but like that fact in itself, I don't think means there's been a coup. I think we have
Okay,
to wait
because
to see how this plays out.
the left on Twitter and other publications, and a pretty left-leaning publication like The Guardian, um, are portraying it that way, right?
Yes, I know that.
Okay, so that's why I mean the listeners may not be hearing that side of the story. That okay, it's actually something that another, but he might not, the style might be off, but this is actually not an illegal thing to do.
Well, we don't know. I mean, there's separation of powers, right? So the Congress gets to, power the purse. They get to decide what the next year's budget's going to be. The
Although
Senate,
they're sort of they're abdicating a lot of those
or
powers right now.
and they're controlled by Republicans, and they're advocating, so they're
Right.
going along, and the courts will take challenges. So whether this is legal or not, I mean, a Democrat would say it's illegal, but it doesn't matter what a Democrat says. What matters is what the courts eventually say, and if the courts say it's illegal, Trump can't do it. So
It's the hostility. It's also sort of the broad hammer smashing everything approach, right? And then kind of trying to like reverse engineer and put back together a piece that shouldn't have been broken. Whereas someone else, Michael's right, it's the president's prerogative to choose his people to enforce his agenda in accordance with the law. Trump is clearly pushing the boundaries of what he can do and is going to see who's willing to stop him. And the answer is right now, not a ton of people. But so that feels different. The other thing that feels different is every 4 years when you live in DC, if a new administration comes in, the political people change, right? You suddenly have a whole group of Democrats trying to get hired. It would have been at big tech companies and Uber and Airbnb and consulting firms, and then all the Republican appointees come in. I have a Democratic friend who sort of joked that like the Obama people, when he lost or when he left and then Trump won, were sort of like superheroes frozen in amber, waiting to get reactivated for Biden and they come back in. But what's different is the career civil servants normally stay, right? But when you have someone, and all presidents talk, or all candidates almost always talk about making government more efficient and smaller and reducing waste, but Trump is actually kind of trying to do that in a pretty aggressive way. And so again, I live in DC. My 6-year-old, came home from school, and her best friend, she said, my best friend says that Trump is trying to take her mom's job away. And normally you'd say like, no, 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 and the answer is like, well, yes, he is. She's a career federal employee, and Trump wants to take those jobs away, essentially. And that's quite new. She's not a political appointee, So there is a different feel in DC when you live and work here.
Well, we're at time to sign off, but I know that right before we started interviewing, you both just uh, posted an article that scoop that you've had. So I wonder if you could just tell us about that story briefly, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. So when Trump came to Washington in 2017, the federally funded arts community kind of gave him a cold shoulder. The initial group of people at the Kennedy Center Honors said they wouldn't go to a White House reception. There was an advisory committee, a president's advisory committee on the arts that had been appointed by Obama that resigned en masse in protest. Trump is coming back to town with a very different attitude. He's showing that he's the boss. And so our scoop today was that he plans to dismiss many of the board members of the Kennedy Center, and he's considering appointing himself to be the chairman of the Kennedy Center, which will no doubt change the type of programming that happens at the Kennedy Center.
Kid Rock can play the Kennedy Center. We can get Hulk Hogan in there.
That's right. I mean, Kid Rock probably could have played before, but it may be Kid Rock leading the Kennedy Center, a board member of the Kennedy. I mean, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but that was it. That basically, this is all part of a piece that Trump is coming back to power with a much more sophisticated understanding of how to use it and what his levers are and what he wants. And he was caught unawares for much of the first 6 months, 8 months of his first 2 years of his term. And he's settling a lot of scores.
Yeah, and the way someone put it to us was the first term he really didn't go because the artists were going to boycott him. It was embarrassing. So it just sort of wasn't part of his Washington experience. And now his attitude is screw that, right? Melania and I aren't going to not go to the Kennedy Center because Robert De Niro, this is a quote, doesn't like us. They're going to remake it in their image, and they're going to show up, and they're going to hope that the left gets infuriated by what they see. And my guess is that will play out exactly as they hope.
Ashley and Michael, thanks for joining us. Listeners, you can find their work at The Atlantic Monthly, which you should go read.
Thank you.